Good morning. Welcome to Unity of Springfield Adult Education, History of Religions, and New Thought Spirituality. My name is John Brocker. Please join me as we spend some time this morning studying Gandhi as a man and how his spiritual journey led him to teach a type of combat that was seated in peace and love. And then maybe some suggestions about how we might move in that direction. We'll begin with a few verses from the Gita, followed by a few moments of silence. The one I love who is incapable of ill will and returns love for hatred, living beyond the reach of I and mine, of pleasure of pain, full of mercy, contented, self-controlled, firm in faith, with all his heart and all his mind, given to me, with such a one I am in love. Not agitating the world or by it agitated. They stand above the sway of elation, competition and fear, accepting life, good and bad as it comes. They are pure, efficient, detached, ready to meet every demand. I make on them as humble an instrument of my work, who serve both friend and foe with equal love, not buoyed up by praise nor cast down by blame, alike in heat and cold, pleasure and pain, free from selfish attachments and self-will, ever full in harmony everywhere, firm in faith, such as these are dear to me. Okay, well, back in the early 70s, following the death of Martin Luther King, there was a group marauding around the University of Chicago calling themselves something like the Student Union for Violent Non-Action. And during the summer, they accosted people with water guns and shooting them down. Nonviolence is not non-action. A little bit about Gandhi. He was born Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. He was born October 2nd, 1869. As a child, he was very, very shy. He was a bit below average as a student, possibly because of some of his anxiety that he experienced. And he was afraid of the dark. So much so that he required a lamp burning in order to go to sleep at night. At age 13, he was part of an arranged marriage where he married Kasturbai. At age 14, his father dies. At age 18, his first son is born, and he sails to London to study law. He also studies the English. He copies them, started wearing clothing like them, before returning to his spiritual, cultural roots and a simpler lifestyle. After he completed law school, got his degree, he returned to India and finding that his mother had died during his journey home. after failing practicing law in India a few different times, at age 23 in 1893, he took a job from a law firm, a Muslim law firm in South Africa, where many Indians worked labor jobs. And so when he went to South Africa, the first week that he was there, he gets thrown off of a train for refusing to move out of a car that was supposed to just be for whites. Initially, there weren't any white people on the train, so it wasn't an issue. But then somebody came on, and they told him that he had to get out. And when he refused, he was tossed off the train, spending a night out in the cold. And it had a real effect on him. It was something that really stuck in his craw, and felt like he had to do something about that. Within a year of being there in South Africa, he founded the Natal, which is a state within South Africa, Indian Congress. And he campaigned to reduce the poll tax very successfully, so from 25 pounds to 3 pounds in order to vote. And the next year, having had that success, he set up a successful law firm. By 1896, Indians outnumbered whites in the state of Natal in South Africa, and the harassment and discrimination towards the Indian folks became worse than it was in India, which was under British rule, or in Britain, where he had been. So he was pretty upset and pretty willing to try and see if there was something he could do about it. After a brief stay in India, he returned to South Africa without his family, and he was beaten by a mob of white folks, but he refused to prosecute. He continued to work on some labor issues over that period of time. And then in 1899, there was a Boer War, which was a fight between the British and some Dutch settlers. And during that time, he set up a ambulance corps. And saw some things because of war and of violence that impacted him and some of his thinking. In 1907, he started a very organized passive resistance campaign, which was more than just local kinds of things. And of course, then he was arrested and then eventually imprisoned. He spent a lot of time in South African jails. In 1908 rather, he coins the term Satyagraha. And Satyagraha is a term which gives action to nonviolent movement and replaced the word passive in passive resistance, which he felt was not very accurate and was difficult to explain why people would want to go along with a passive program when they felt like they were being wronged. In 1914, through the Satyagraha movement, he passes a meaningful legislation to protect Indian worker rights in South Africa. And that was one of his first really kind of nationwide type of successes. And he returns to India and is called, for the first time, Mahatma, which means great soul, and which I always heard about Gandhi as being Mahatma Gandhi, but that was really more of this term of endearment that he had been given. So, and then when he returns to India after having spent all of those years in South Africa, working for Indian rights in South Africa, he pretty much immediately starts to do campaigns within India. And he started really with, because he never would even use the word untouchable, but within the caste system within India, there was these group of persons who were really persona non grata and did not have the right to ownership or votes, property ownership, so on and so forth. And so he started to campaign for them. And he gave them the name Harijan, which means children of God. And he spent really the rest of his life collecting money for the Harijan and fighting for their rights to be able to enter temples and to be able to enter into the different walks of life that would allow them to have economic and social ownership within the Indian culture. He also led several Satyagrahas, which he had to suspend because violence would erupt. And that's something that at first they really didn't understand, and but they began to respect the fact that he would do so, which really turned out to be very important in later years. He also started this because they would tax Indian goods that then they would sell, send overseas, turn into more finished products and sell back to the Indians. So he called a boycott on foreign cloth, and he started the practice of spinning cloth daily, which he then would use to clothe himself as well. But this is also something that Gandhi did, that if there was something that he was preaching to somebody else or encouraging or cajoling people to do, then you would find out that he was also willing to do that himself. That was a key feature of his action. In 1930, and he was at that point in time, he had spent time. They had developed an Indian Congress, which was a legislature of sorts that had advisory capacity. They didn't actually have the right to pass laws, but they were able to express opinions to the British. In 1930, he started the Salt March, and what the British had done is they had a company that had a monopoly on salt, and they taxed the salt pretty high. And so he decided that what they were going to do is they were going to go ahead and gather salt for their own use, which was against the law. So they did a salt march. He started inland quite a few miles and then walked and gathered people in different towns until they had thousands of people down on the Indian Ocean shore to then collect salt along the shore. And that was a beginning of really the independence of India from Great Britain, and really started and got the 400 million Indians into his psyche, and they very much were drawn by that. because it's something that they could all understand and do. In 1940, the Indian Congress agreed to help support the British in World War II if they were given independence, but the independence was denied. They did not. The British did not agree to let, after the war, go ahead and let them have their independence. So, so they decided they were not going to go out of their way to help Great Britain in World War II, and so of course they were thrown in prison. In 1942, he was thrown in prison with his wife and with other people that were close to him, and she died in prison in 1944, and others also that he was close to died while they were in prison. When World War II ends, all the political prisoners released, and the political party in power in Great Britain was preparing for this independence. And these were very difficult times because there was a lot of ethnic violence or religious violence between the Hindus and the Muslims within India. There has been quite a bit of violence between the 30s and 40s. And he was hoping that the whole Indian subcontinent would be one nation, but as it turns out, Pakistan was created, and they had two different countries. Independence Day for India and Pakistan was August 15th, 1947. And on January 30th, 1948, on the way to a prayer meeting, Gandhi is assassinated. It's just a gunshot right to his chest. And he died reciting Rama, 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 which is God. And was one of his mantras that he used on a very regular basis. So how did Gandhi get to the point to where he was able to create so much power and support, and through nonviolence means really bring the British Empire really to its knees, and kept it both what he did in South Africa and then what he did in India? Well, as he will always said, and the author of my source book, which is Esron Ekanath Esron, that it really began with a self-transformation initially, which that comes really as no surprise, but that's where he found that it all began. And it really began early in his marriage, when he would find that he felt like he had the right to tell his wife that, he wanted this, he wanted that, and all of his needs should be met. And his wife was really one of the first people who taught him Satyagrahas, in that he was met with resistance and love and patience, although she stuck to her guns on many issues. And when she didn't, even when he won out, it wasn't always a pleasant process to go through. And he always talked about how important it was to have someone who would be honestly and lovingly call you on your own stuff. And how a lot of that started at home. Also, when he was in Great Britain in law school, while he was studying British ways, he started to buy suits and dress like them and go to tea parties, and took up violin playing, and was kind of trying to live the good life. And a couple of things made him feel uneasy about it. First of all, he was on his older brother's dime. And the second thing was it just didn't feel like a fit for him. And so he decided he was going to live his life a little bit more simply. And he had promised his mother, who he was very close to, that he would live a vegetarian life, which wasn't that easy in Great Britain at the time. But he did eventually find a group of vegetarians, and then he joined a group of other Brits who were also vegetarians and worked towards trying to find some good ways of eating vegetarian, both healthy wise as well as tastefully. It was also very important to him while practicing civil disobedience that there wasn't judgment about the person, that the focus was about what was right for the person that had been initially being harmed. But he also set aside strikes and such when there were other things that were outside of the strike or whatever was going on. It didn't have anything to do with that. That was somehow being harming the people that he was fighting. And he would sometimes just stop the strike just so that he wasn't adding insult to injury to the other person. And people really took notice that even though he was fighting people, arguing with them, that he also cared about them. And he showed that. He went out of his way to make sure that he was respecting them and showing them that he cared about what happened to them, even though he also cared about winning his battle that he had with them. And that piece of really going out of his way of respecting others who he was in conflict with, his enemies, so to speak, loving your enemies, so to speak, sounds vaguely familiar from someone. That not only does it seem like the right thing to do, but it's extremely effective, because then the person who was his enemy had positive feelings for him as well. And so when he was being hurt, or his people were being hurt, it didn't feel so good to the people that he was taking on, and they often would change their positions because of that. He also talked frequently about how important it was when he was living simply and no longer buying fancy clothes or really caring, about what that was, how he looked, and what other people would say about how he looked. That non-attachment allowed for getting out of your own way. Not only in action, but also in that internal dialogue about, what will people think? Is this the right thing to do? He often, when he was going into a political situation, that he didn't really know what he was going to say, but he was unencumbered by this making sure that he made it look right. He was more focused on the truth, what's important. And by sticking to that, with that level of genuineness, it was very potent. And he also talks about that's also what often is important with an artist, that they need to get out of their own way, or a writer, and they need to get out of their own way in order to really be effective at what it is that they do. So he had some really good quotes that we're going to cover a few of. Nonviolence is a way of thinking, a way of life, not a tactic, but a way of putting love to work in resolving problems, healing relationships, and generally raising the quality of our lives. And this is by the author. In other words, nonviolence is a skill, just like learning to read. Love is a skill. Forgiveness is a skill. The transformation of anger is a skill. All these can be learned. We cannot say we aren't capable of nonviolence. All we can say is we're not willing to do what is necessary to learn. So some of the base concepts are ahisma, which means not wanting to kill, is literally what it means. It's also often used interchangeably with unconditional love. It's a Sanskrit term, as is Satyagraha. And Satyagraha is seen as being love in action. And that there's a need to use both of them. There's nothing new about ahisma, Gandhi insisted. It's as old as the hills. He says, civil disobedience is the inherent right of a citizen. He dare not give it up without ceasing to be a man. Civil disobedience is never followed by anarchy. Criminal disobedience can lead to it. Every state puts down criminal disobedience by force. It perishes if it does not. But to put down civil disobedience is to attempt to imprison conscience. And disobedience, to be civil, must be sincere, respectful, restrained, never defiant, must be based on some well-understood principle, and must not be capricious, and above all, must have no ill will or hatred behind it. Truth resides in every human heart, and one has to search for it there. To be guided by truth as one sees it. But no one has a right to coerce others to act according to his own view of truth. A Satyagrahi, in other words, a person who practices Satyagraha, bids goodbye to fear. He is therefore never afraid of trusting the opponent. Even if the opponent plays him false 20 times, the Satyagrahi is ready to trust him the 21st time. For an implicit trust in human nature is the very essence of his creed. Satyagraha is gentle. It never wounds. It must not be the result of anger or malice. It is never fussy, never impatient, never vociferous. It is the direct opposite of compulsion. It was conceived as a complete substitute for violence. Gandhi says, I have not been able to see any difference between the Sermon on the Mount and the Bhagavad Gita. What the sermon describes in a graphic manner, the Bhagavad Gita reduces to a scientific formula. It may not be a scientific book in the accepted sense of the term, but it has argued out the law of love, the law of abandon, as I would call it, in a scientific manner. So, we hear about mantras. And a common mantra that Gandhi used, he shared at his death. And it was something that he just came right to him when he was shot. But another practice that he had, was he took 8 verses out of the Gita and he spoke it every day. And so it just became a part of the fabric of his life. So in the Gita, Arjuna is asking enthusiastically from Krishna, how can I recognize such a person when I see him? What are the marks of the man who lives always in wisdom, completely established in himself? Tell me how he talks, how he acts, how he conducts himself when under attack. And Krishna replies, they live in wisdom, who see themselves in all and all in them, whose love for the Lord of love has consumed every selfish desire and sense craving, tormenting the heart, not agitated by grief or hankering after pleasure. They live free from lust and fear and anger. Fettered no more by selfish attachments, they are not elated by good fortune, nor depressed by bad. Such are the seers. When you keep thinking about sense objects, attachment comes. Attachment breeds desire, the lust of possession which, when thwarted, burns to anger. Anger clouds the judgment and robs you of the power to learn from past mistakes. Lost is the discriminative faculty, and your life is utter waste. But when you move amidst the world of sense, from both attachment and aversion freed, there comes the peace in which all sorrows end, and you live in the wisdom of the self. The disunited mind is far from wise. How can it meditate? How be at peace? When you know no peace, how can you know joy? When you let your mind follow the siren, call of the senses they carry away, your better judgment as a cyclone drives a boat off the charted course to its doom. As the rivers flow into the ocean, but cannot make the vast ocean overflow, so the flow of the magic streams of the sense world into the sea of peace, that is the sage. They are forever free who have broken out of the ego cage of I and mine, to be united with the Lord of love. This is the supreme state. Attain to this and pass from death to immortality. So when we're struggling with this, which is, we're humans. He says, I will give you a talisman. Whenever you are in doubt, when the self becomes too much with you, try the following expedient. Recall the face of the poorest and the most helpless man or woman whom you may have seen and ask yourself if the step you are now contemplating is going to be of any use to them. Will they be able to gain anything by it? Will it restore them to control over their own life and destiny? In other words, will it lead to self-rule for the hungry and also spiritually starved millions of our countrymen? Then you will find your doubts and yourself melting away. Ahimsa and truth are so intertwined that it is practically impossible to disentangle and separate them. They are like two sides of a coin, or rather a smooth, unstamped metallic disc. Who can say which is the obverse and which is the reverse? Nevertheless, ahimsa is the means, truth is the end. So in his political days, Satyagraha meant gathering and getting other people to behave in certain ways to keep from supporting harmful civil action. And then he talks about self-sahatrika or individual satyagraha. And that it's essentially an attitude, an interior condition. So when we come from it, even when you get a group of people, it really means that the other people involved have to have some buy-in into their own personal spiritual space. If a single satyagrahi holds out to the end, victory is certain. And it's portable. So it means that it comes up to oneself. One has not to go out in search of it. And yet it's only easy to find that when one practices the discipline aimed at removal of self-interest. So even though you might be doing things that might accumulate dollars and cents, growth of food, other things that people might think of as being really material things, if in your heart it's not just for self-interest, that makes a difference. An individual can generate the irresistible power of Satyagraha only when he has become passion-free in thought, speech, and action, able to rise above the opposing currents of love and hatred, attachment and repulsion. Stripped of its discipline, Satyagraha is without its fundamental source of strength, that soul force by which alone it commands our attention. For if this is the only permanent thing in life, if this is the only thing that counts, then whatever you bestow on mastering it is well spent. Seek ye first the kingdom of heaven, and everything else shall be added unto you. The kingdom of heaven is ahimsa. It's a tall order. It's difficult. So the other thing that they look at is something called Satyagraha, family Satyagraha. Personal relationships offer fertile ground to learn and use Satyagraha. So when you're letting yourself get out of the way, truly listening to what the other person's saying without planning your response. Willingness to learn. He says, I learned the lesson of nonviolence from my wife. When I tried to bend her to my will, her determined resistance to my will, on the one hand, and her quiet submission to the suffering of my stupidity involved, on the other, ultimately made me ashamed of myself and cured me of my stupidity. In the end, she became my teacher in nonviolence. And then there's Satyagraha at work. The best way of doing things is usually my way. And as an Indian sage once put it, everyone thinks his watch has the right time. Again, the process of getting out of our way, thinking about what's best for the positive goals of the organization as long as you're a part of that becomes very important. I also wanted to share a little something that I researched about Mr. Isaran, who wrote this book. And he calls it the 8-point program of passage meditations. And it really comes, I think, from observing Gandhi, and he developed these 8 points that I thought were maybe a place for people to create a little bit of structure in their life, a little bit of the discipline, which instead of, just sometimes it seems totally intimidating and unattainable to live a life as sterile and without material possessions the way that Gandhi did. Number one is a daily meditation on a passage. And that passages out of the Gita is what, since he was in his 20s, Gandhi just said that to himself every day. And it became kind of he would start his day off that way, and that kind of became his guiding principle, and he just had it on his lips and on his mind that gave him the strength that led to the Satyagraha movements. The repetition of a mantra, and he often would use that just throughout the day, and that's the way that it's encouraged. Mantram is usually just, a word or a syllable or two, and does not, such as the Ram, Ram, Ram that Gandhi used, but whatever one chooses is suggested. Number 3 is just slowing down. I have to remind myself about that one a lot. 4th one is one-pointed attention. One that I know I also struggle with. Number 5 is training the senses instead of having them train you. Number 6 is putting others first. Number 7 is spiritual fellowship. And number 8 is spiritual reading. Well, thank you for listening in. Again, my source book was Gandhi the Man by Eknath Esaran. He's an easy read, and there's some nice practical pieces in the book, and also it's very fascinating because he spent a lot more time with some of the stories as he had successes and failures with the politics of both India and in South Africa. So we're going to end in prayer, so let's take a couple of breaths. May we act with Satyagraha, or holding on to truth, in every aspect of our lives. May we be ahimsa, or absence of violence and unconditional love. May we be open to the effort and discipline required to act with Satyagraha, even when it is not easy. May we have the wisdom to start with our immediate surroundings, loved ones, and our relationship with ourselves. May we recall that there are no limits to our capacities, and that evil is only real insofar as we support it. May we know the divinity in ourselves and know the divinity in our so-called enemies in a way that transforms us both. God, may you reveal this or something better.